I've been a scout since I was 8 years old, and since I led my team last year, I had to handle all the paperwork and make calls to locate camping locations. In the middle of November, I needed to locate a campsite. However, I chose to postpone the weekend until a week in advance since I was sluggish. I made the decision to give some owners a call a week before the weekend to make sure I had a place to stay. I dialed a lot of numbers, but every owner was either unresponsive or non-existent. However, because it was the last number on the list, I suddenly noticed one that I had never called before. When I called, an elderly woman answered. I conducted the entire introduction process. We came to terms, and she allowed my crew and I to stay on her land. I visited her property in the afternoon to make sure everything was in working order, including the campfire area, tent position, and potable water. The location is pleasant, albeit a little dim. A week went by, and Saturday came. The Saturday came to a satisfactory conclusion. We watched a fantastic night show, ate a ton, and played some awesome games. I stayed up late to complete paperwork for the following day as my team went to sleep in the tent. Now that it was midnight, we had an early church morning, so I made the decision to go to bed. One of my 8 newbies wanted to use the potty, which is a tree, and begged me to go with her as I turned off the flashlight. I got it, having company at night is preferable, especially when you're in the woods. As she went about her business, I noticed some noises in the vicinity. It's nothing, I assured myself, it's probably just some animals looking for food. As we made our way back to the tent, I heard footsteps getting closer. I didn't panic when I heard those footsteps. Perhaps the elderly woman was making sure the fire wasn't too close to the house or something. It was midnight, and I couldn't shake an uneasy feeling, so why would she do this at this hour? After hearing no footfall for roughly 15 minutes, I heard more approaching our tents. I'm glad that none of my girls woke up because they would have been afraid. The eldest among us was myself. Their age difference was roughly 3 or 4 years. I realized that things were getting strange when I heard footsteps coming from the back of the tent, which appeared to be those of a single person. I have to take action. Fortunately, one of my arrivals had left some members from the fire, so I was able to inspect the interior of the tent and see what was going on between the fire and my tent's zipper. After a minute, a figure emerged between my tent and the fire. My breathing stopped. I froze, really. I noticed a shadow approaching the tent's zipper and immediately started to go in the direction of my phone. If something happened, I texted one of my leaders who was camped close, but I knew it would take too long, so I had to come up with a quick solution. That's when an idea came to me. I put on my bell and programmed my alarm to sound like the loud siren we used for night games sometimes. And my daughters came too. The shadow figure was beginning to unzip. Truly, I saw fingers extending downward. But the figure fled swiftly back to their starting point as soon as they heard my girls waking up. At that moment, I noticed 2 additional figures running back in the identical way. Everything worked out nicely in the end. Fortunately, I never had to deal with those silhouettes again because my commander showed about 20 minutes later and stayed the entire night. Alright, so I'm a 26-year-old man, and for a full year I had been organizing a camping vacation with my dad and wife. We don't spend as much time in the woods and away from town as I would like, so I wanted things to be flawless. This is set in East Texas's densely forested Davy Crockett National Forest. My dad made the early decision to choose a suitable location for us to camp earlier that day. The location of our campsite was outlined by the 2 dirt roads on either side and the overlook to the north. In the space between the 2 highways, we set up camp. Around 11 a.m., my spouse and I arrived and greeted my dad down there. After setting up camp, we continued to enjoy the day until it was almost time for supper, at which point we began preparing our evening meal. Just as we were finishing our dinner, we noticed this truck making circles over our campsite. After circumnavigating us multiple times, he eventually pulled directly up to our camp and exited his vehicle. He continued by telling us that the firewood that was lying about belonged to his family and that this was their camping. Since campsites in this specific woodland are first come, first served, my dad had been there since 9 in the morning. He then requested whether he could camp beside us, and as we were friends, we answered in the affirmative. We were unaware that he meant to be precisely on top of us when he stated, next to us. He blocked my truck by backing his camper so near to our tents and cars. Since there were so many other campgrounds available, we weren't sure why he was acting in this way, but we chose to ignore it and focus on having fun nevertheless. Soon afterward, we observed a white Dodge properly circling us. This truck circled our area multiple times, giving us a strange feeling, but we brushed it off because the overlook made the area popular. We had a late night of drinking and playing about, so we made the decision to head home. I was sound asleep when I heard a spine-tingling scream coming from outside the trees. "What the heck was that?" I asked my wife, startled awake. Another scream can be heard in the distance around 30 seconds later. I took out my revolver at this moment and opened the tent so we could get a better look outside. We could see a little way into our campsite since my dad had left a lamp going. Just then, we noticed the white Dodge appropriately speeding down the street in our wake. They kept going down the road until they vanished from view. They slammed the door of their pickup and let out a shriek when we heard them stop. After that, they got back into their truck and cautiously drove the opposite road in front of our campsite. They drove until they were out of sight, which horrified us into believing they were going to rob us. Then, we heard gunfire. The gunfire stopped, and they drove away. We didn't call the police at this point since we assumed they might just be inebriated and behaving foolish, plus we didn't have a signal anyhow. All we did was try to sleep again. We had to perform a beer run for my dad the following day. There were cops everywhere we turned into the main highway after leaving the camping area. They had 2 small sons halted. We went into town, assuming that they were the ones causing havoc the previous evening. After speaking with my dad, the police were departing as we returned to our tent. They informed my father that the young men were being robbed while they were hunting by the guys in the white suit. When the boys noticed that their camp was being looted, the responsible men grabbed firearms on the young boys and proceeded to rob them at gunpoint. Even though it was unusual, we believed that they would have robbed us if it weren't for the folks who camped directly on top of us. Our campsite appeared larger than it actually was because to them. Naturally, those in the white were never apprehended. During my childhood, my family would gather in July or August of each summer and spend 2 weeks camping in White Lake State Park in Tamworth, New Hampshire. That's where I made some of my favorite childhood memories. At the campground, my cousins and the kids from the neighborhood used to play water balloon battles, rollerblading, Nerf gun warfare, and flashlight tag. After my grandma died away, my family stopped getting together to camp out when I was in my late teens. This particular recollection from one of my final years there has stayed with me. I was 16 years old a little over 10 years ago. I discovered I had a missed call on my cheap tiny track phone at around 10 p.m. I figured I'd walk outside for a little peace while my family enjoyed some jokes and s'mores making over the campfire. I followed a lengthy, winding trail that goes up to the restroom at the end and winds between other campsites. I had no intention of using the restroom. All I wanted to do was locate an unoccupied campsite and use a picnic table to place my phone call. Since the entire side of the campground where I was going was empty, there were several of those. There were no other campers in the vicinity. It was dark and peaceful. I decided to camp, then. I took a seat at the table. I could barely see my surroundings because behind me, up on top of the hill, were the lights of a far-off bathroom. I spent around 20 minutes talking with my pal on the phone. I notice a shadow approaching me from the road while I sit there looking straight ahead. The figure is moving in my direction, the direction of all these deserted campgrounds. I could tell it was a human being. People taking nighttime walks through the campground are not that uncommon. However, most of the folks I see have flashlights. This individual didn't. There was no reason for me to be freaked out at this point. I was merely observing with curiosity. I could make out more of the contour as the individual drew nearer, and that I was staring at a man. I also saw that he was moving more slowly. I could not take my eyes off of him. He stopped moving after a minute or two as I carried on talking to him on my phone. He's just standing in the middle of the road, staring directly into my campground. I doubt if he was aware that I could see him. I looked back at him, and he looked back at me. He was tall and a touch heavily set. It was also apparent to me that he was donning a lightweight jacket. Though I was unable to make out many facial features, I assumed I was looking at a man in his 30s or 40s. Now, I could feel alarms ringing in my head. By now my brain was a mushy mess. I'm not moving. My friend was talking on the phone, but I was no longer paying attention. This guy and I were staring at each other. Then he was moving again. He was cautiously approaching me on tiptoe, as if he wanted to avoid making a sound. He leaned forward in a slightly hunched position, putting one foot in front of the other. He appeared to be ready to charge at me. I suddenly broke out of that fuzzy, frozen state of mind, jumped off the picnic table, and began sprinting through the campsite in the direction of the trail. Behind me, I could hear him stomping. Scuffling leaves and rapid, hefty footfall. The sound of footsteps grew closer and louder. I returned to that little trail. When he approached my location, I heard branches breaking underfoot. Based on this sound, I assumed the man fell or nearly fell or was struck in the face by a falling limb. He probably didn't know the trail as well as I did. For some reason, that made him give up on pursuing me. I did not pause to turn around. I just ran and ran until I returned to the campsite where my family was camping. They were still grinning and laughing by the campfire when I returned. I was shaking and started crying. I gave an explanation of what had occurred. "Oh my gosh, he probably thought he recognized you and was going up to give you a nice scare as a joke," my aunt remarked. She brushed me off. "Yeah, he probably stopped running after he realized that he didn't actually know you," my cousin added in response. "Now he probably feels foolish." With a collective chuckle, they shifted the topic. I believe I was written off since I'm just a socially awkward person in general, and nobody wanted the positive vibes of the evening to be wrecked. I'm bashful and extremely cautious. I let them persuade me that I was just overthinking and overreacting for the time being. Years later, though, I find myself looking back and shaking my head at this. It was a lovely trip except from that one incident, but I wish I had been taken seriously.